Imagine facing down a man who was faster with a gun than anyone alive. Now imagine he's a dentist. From the famous Jesse James to the mysterious Johnny Ringo, we're counting down the outlaws so feared, their names were only whispered. Their darkest deeds are about to be revealed. 1. Jesse James. Everyone has heard of Jesse James. The stories paint him as a kind of American Robin Hood, a hero who stole from the rich banks and powerful railroads to give to the poor farmers. He was a former soldier from the Civil War who, people said, was just fighting back against a system that had wronged him and his family. His daring train robberies and bank heists made him a folk hero, a symbol of defiance against authority. People all over the country read about his escapades in dime novels and newspapers and cheered him on. But here's the kicker. The truth about Jesse James is a whole lot darker. Truth be told, there is very little evidence that he ever shared his stolen loot with anyone but his own gang members. He wasn't a noble hero. He was the leader of a ruthless gang that included his own brother, Frank. They were responsible for taking many lives during their robberies, often downing innocent people who just got in the way. For almost 2 decades, the James Younger gang terrorized the Midwest. In the end, it wasn't a sheriff who brought him down. It was a cowardly new gang member who wanted the reward money. Jesse James was a master of disguise and escape, but he was eventually brought down by betrayal from within his own circle. Even so, his legend was so big, some folks had a hard time believing anyone could be more feared. But our next outlaw was just a teenager. And some say his list of victims was even longer. 2. Billy the Kid. Believe it or not, one of the most feared men in the entire Wild West was basically still a kid. His real name was probably Henry McCarty, but everyone knew him as Billy the Kid. He was a young man with a quick smile and an even quicker temper. His story is a whirlwind of cattle rustling, jailbreaks, and shootouts. He got his start as a young troublemaker in New Mexico, but things got really serious when he got involved in a bloody conflict known as the Lincoln County War. This was a brutal feud between rival business groups, and Billy chose a side. He became a regulator, a kind of hired gun, fighting for his boss's honor. It was during this time that his reputation really grew. Legend says Billy the Kid was responsible for the end of 21 men, 1 for each year of his life, though the real number was likely closer to 9. Still, that was more than enough to make him the most wanted man in the territory. He was known for being an expert shot and for an incredible escape where he managed to get out of his handcuffs and take down 2 guards to get away. The famous lawman Pat Garrett finally tracked him down and ended his story in a dark room in Fort Sumner. Billy the Kid was a legend because of his youth and his shockingly violent life. He lived fast and his story ended young. But while Billy was a hot-headed fighter, our next outlaw was the complete opposite. He was a cold, calculating professional whose stone-cold demeanor was perhaps the most terrifying thing about him. 3. John Wesley Hardin. Now, let's talk about a man who was dangerous on a whole different level. John Wesley Hardin wasn't a bank robber or a gang leader in the same way as Jesse James. He was a gunslinger, pure and simple, and many people from that time considered him the deadliest man with a pistol. Hardin was the son of a preacher, but he did not follow a peaceful path. He had his first serious run-in with the law when he was just 15 years old, and he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. What made Hardin so feared was his incredibly short temper and his belief that he was always in the right. He had a personal code, but that code often meant he was the only one who got to walk away. The most famous story about him, and it speaks volumes, happened in a hotel in Abilene, Kansas. A man in the next room was snoring too loudly, and it was bothering Hardin. Instead of just banging on the wall, Hardin pulled out his pistols and fired right through it, putting the noisy neighbor down for good. As it turns out, he claimed dozens of victims over his lifetime. He was eventually captured by the Texas Rangers and spent many years in prison where he actually studied law. But his violent past caught up to him, and he met his end in a saloon. Hardin was a lone wolf, a man driven by his own dark code. But some outlaws learned that there's strength in numbers, and our next group wasn't just a gang. They were a full-blown army of robbers who were all about having a good time while pulling off the biggest heists in history. 4. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You've probably seen the movie. But the real story of Butch Cassidy and his gang, the Wild Bunch, is even more amazing. Unlike the cold-hearted gunslingers, Butch, whose real name was Robert Parker, was known for being charming, witty, and incredibly clever. He was the brains of the operation. His most famous partner was Harry Longabaugh, better known as the Sundance Kid. Sundance was the opposite of Butch. He was quiet, intense, and one of the fastest draws in the West. Together, they were an unstoppable team. The Wild Bunch specialized in robbing trains and banks, and they were experts at it. They created something called the Outlaw Trail, a series of secret hideouts and supply stations that stretched from Canada down to Mexico. This allowed them to disappear after a big score. They were famous for using too much dynamite to blow open train safes, often destroying the whole rail car and sending money flying everywhere. They were incredibly successful and became folk heroes because Butch Cassidy had a rule: he tried his best to avoid hurting anyone during his robberies. But the law, especially a famous group of detectives called the Pinkertons, never gave up the chase. Eventually, the pressure became too much, and Butch and Sundance fled to South America, hoping to live a peaceful life. Their story, however, does not have a happy Hollywood ending. Butch and Sundance were the rock stars of the outlaw world. But the West wasn't just a man's game. Believe it or not, our next outlaw was a woman who proved she could be just as tough and notorious as any of the men. 5. Belle Starr. They called her the Bandit Queen. Belle Starr, born Myra Maybelle Shirley, was one of the most famous female outlaws in American history. Her story is wrapped up in mystery and legend. She grew up in a well-to-do family but was drawn to a life of excitement. She spent a lot of time with some of the most notorious outlaws of the day, including members of the James Younger gang. She was married several times, always to men with questionable reputations. This connection to the criminal underworld is what made her famous. Truth be told, it's hard to say how many crimes Belle actually committed herself. She was known for being a skilled rider and a good shot. She dressed in fine clothes, often riding her horse side saddle with 2 pistols on her hips, which made for a striking image. She was accused of horse theft and harboring fugitives at her home in the Indian Territory, a place that became known as a haven for outlaws. Newspapers loved writing about her, exaggerating her exploits and turning her into a larger-than-life figure. She might not have been a criminal mastermind, but she was definitely at the center of the outlaw world. Her life came to a mysterious end when she was ambushed by an unknown attacker. Belle Starr used her reputation to build a legend. But our next outlaw was a different kind of performer. He was a robber who was so polite and theatrical that his victims were often more baffled than scared, and he always left behind a signature clue. 6. Black Bart. Not all outlaws were rough and tough gunslingers. In fact, one of the most successful stagecoach robbers in California was a well-dressed gentleman who never once fired a weapon. His name was Charles Bowles, but he was known to the world as Black Bart. He was a robber with a flair for the dramatic. Black Bart would appear on the trail, often with a shotgun, and politely ask the driver to throw down the strongbox. He was so calm and confident that he usually got what he wanted without any trouble. Here's the really wild part. Black Bart was a poet. After 2 of his robberies, he left behind short, witty poems signed Black Bart, the P.O.8. His verses made him a media sensation. For years, he terrified the stagecoach companies, who had no idea who this mysterious, eloquent bandit could be. He always worked alone and on foot, and he was able to outsmart the lawmen time and time again. What made him so feared wasn't violence, but his cleverness and his ghostly ability to appear and disappear without a trace. His downfall came from a simple mistake. During one robbery, he dropped a handkerchief which had a laundry mark on it that detectives used to track him down. They discovered he was actually a respected elderly man living in San Francisco. Black Bart proved one man could cause a lot of trouble. But what happens when a whole family decides to go into the outlaw business? Our next story is about a group of brothers who thought they were invincible and decided to attempt the most daring robbery ever conceived. 7. The Dalton Gang. The Dalton gang was a classic case of good guys gone bad. Three of the Dalton brothers, Grat, Bob, and Emmett, actually started out as lawmen. But they decided that working on the other side of the law paid a lot better. They formed a gang and quickly became known for robbing trains and banks throughout Kansas and the Oklahoma Territory. Bob Dalton was the ambitious leader, and he had a dream. He wanted his gang to become more famous than even the James Younger gang. To do that, he came up with a bold, almost insane plan. On October 5th, 1892, the Dalton gang decided they would rob two banks at the same time. The banks were across the street from each other in their old hometown of Coffeyville, Kansas. They thought it would be the perfect crime. They even wore fake beards as disguises. But the people of Coffeyville recognized them almost immediately. As the gang was inside the banks, the townspeople grabbed their own weapons and prepared a very unwelcome surprise. When the Daltons came out, the street erupted in a massive firefight. It was a complete disaster for the gang. When the smoke cleared, Grat and Bob Dalton, along with two other gang members, had met their end. Emmett was seriously wounded but survived to stand trial. The Dalton gang's dream of fame ended in a hail of bullets. The Daltons' ambition was their undoing. They let pride get in the way of common sense. Our next outlaw was the exact opposite. He was a highly intelligent man who knew his own limits, but his loyalty to his friends often pulled him into situations that he knew could only end one way. 8. Doc Holliday. John Henry Holliday, known to the world as Doc Holliday, is one of the most fascinating figures of the Old West. He was a dentist from Georgia, a well-educated gentleman who was forced to move west because he had a serious lung condition called tuberculosis. He figured the dry air might help him. He continued to practice dentistry, but he quickly found out he was much better at playing cards. He became a professional gambler, and with that life came the need to be able to handle a pistol, and believe you me, he could handle one. Doc Holliday was known for his calm, cool demeanor, even in the most dangerous situations. He was thin and often sick, but he had a fiery temper and a reputation for being absolutely fearless. His best friend was the famous lawman Wyatt Earp, and their friendship is legendary. Doc stood with Wyatt and his brothers at the famous gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. He was not a lawman, but his loyalty to his friend put him right in the middle of the action. People feared Doc because he seemed to have nothing to lose. He knew his illness would eventually take him, so he wasn't afraid of a fight. He was a walking contradiction, an educated Southern gentleman who was also one of the most skilled gunslingers around. Doc Holliday's story is tied to one of the most famous towns in the West, but the territory just north of Texas, known as Indian Territory, was home to outlaws who were even more ruthless and unpredictable, like our next character, a man who left a trail of chaos wherever he went. 9. Cherokee Bill. Some outlaws became famous for their style or their big heists. Others became feared for their sheer, unpredictable violence. Cherokee Bill, whose birth name was Crawford Goldsby, falls into that second category. He was of mixed heritage, including African American, Native American, and white ancestry, and he grew up in the rough and lawless Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. He started his outlaw career young and quickly earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous men around. Cherokee Bill and his gang robbed banks, stagecoaches, and stores. But what made him so terrifying was his explosive temper. He seemed to lash out for any reason, or for no reason at all. Stories from that time tell of him downing men for simply looking at him the wrong way. He had no code like Butch Cassidy. He was just pure, chaotic danger. He was eventually captured, but his story didn't end there. While in jail awaiting his date with the gallows, he somehow got a pistol smuggled to him. He started a massive breakout attempt that resulted in a guard losing his life. It took a whole group of deputies to finally subdue him. When he was finally brought to his end, a reporter asked if he had any last words. He simply said, "I came here to go, not to talk." Cherokee Bill was a force of nature, a truly wild spirit of the West. His unpredictable nature was his trademark, a trait he shared with our next outlaw, a man so famous for his wild behavior that people called him the shootist of the Southwest. 10. Clay Allison. In the Wild West, there were gunfighters, and then there was Clay Allison. He was a rancher from Texas who had a reputation for being charming and polite when he was sober. But when he was drinking, he became one of the most reckless and feared men on the frontier. Allison had a fiery temper and a strange sense of honor that often led to violence. He wasn't a typical outlaw who robbed banks. Instead, his fame came from his many duels and shootouts. One of his most famous stories involves a rival gunslinger who had a fearsome reputation. Allison, never one to back down, met the man in a saloon. As the story goes, they decided to duel right there. They sat at a table, put their pistols on it, and at the signal, both went for their weapons. Allison was faster. Another time, he led a mob to deal with a man they believed had gotten away with a terrible crime. They took the man from his jail cell and saw to it that he wouldn't harm anyone again. Clay Allison's actions were so wild and unpredictable that even other tough cowboys and lawmen tried to stay out of his way. He was a true shootist, a man who seemed to invite conflict and was terrifyingly good at finishing it. Allison was a legend in Texas and New Mexico. But farther west, in the goldfields of California, another legend was being born, a story of a man who was seen as either a vicious bandit or a heroic freedom fighter, depending on who you asked. 11. Joaquin Murrieta. The legend of Joaquin Murrieta, often called the Robin Hood of El Dorado, is one of the most debated tales of the Old West. The story begins during the California Gold Rush. Murrieta was said to be a Mexican miner who came to California seeking his fortune, but instead of gold, he found prejudice and violence. The story goes that American miners attacked him and his family, and this great injustice turned him into an outlaw, seeking revenge against those who had wronged him. According to the legend, Murrieta formed a gang and began a campaign of robbing and raiding across the state. He targeted corrupt lawmen and greedy miners, becoming a symbol of resistance for the Mexican population. He was said to be handsome, dashing, and almost impossible to catch. The state of California eventually offered a huge reward for him, dead or alive. A group of California Rangers, led by a man named Harry Love, claimed they cornered Murrieta and his gang and brought his journey to a close. They even presented a preserved head in a jar as proof. But here's the thing. Many historians now believe the story was mostly made up. It's possible Murrieta was a real person, or maybe he was a combination of several different bandits. Real or not, his legend as a heroic avenger became incredibly powerful. Murrieta's legend was built on a huge score, the gold of California. Our next outlaw also got his start with one of the biggest gold heists in history, a robbery that made him a household name overnight. 12. Sam Bass. Sam Bass was not your typical hardened criminal. He was born in Indiana and was known for being an honest and hardworking young man. He drifted down to Texas, where he worked as a cowboy and even tried his hand at being a lawman for a short time. He was well-liked and considered a friendly, easygoing guy. So how did he become one of Texas's most notorious outlaws? Well, it all started with a racehorse. Sam bought a fast horse called the Denton Mare and started racing her. He found out he could make more money gambling than working. This led him to other shady ventures, and eventually, he and a partner put a gang together. In 1877, they pulled off one of the most spectacular train robberies in history. They stopped a Union Pacific passenger train in Big Springs, Nebraska, and found a massive shipment of brand new $20 gold coins. They made off with what would be millions of dollars in today's money. The huge heist made Sam Bass and his gang instantly famous and the target of a massive manhunt. But as it turns out, being a great robber doesn't mean you're great at keeping a low profile. The gang started spending their new gold coins all over, which made them easy to track. Sam Bass was a good-natured outlaw, but his time at the top was short-lived, ending in a setup and a final showdown with the Texas Rangers. Sam Bass was betrayed by a member of his own gang, a common story in the outlaw world. But our next outlaw was a mystery. He was an educated man who seemed to be haunted by a deep sadness, and his friendship with the toughest guys in Tombstone made him a legend. 13. Johnny Ringo. The name Johnny Ringo echoes through the history of Tombstone, Arizona. He was an outlaw associated with the Clanton and McClory families, the cowboys who faced off against the Earps and Doc Holliday. But Ringo was different. He wasn't an uneducated ruffian. He was well-read, could quote Shakespeare, and had family connections back east. Yet, he chose a life on the edge of the law in the most dangerous town in the West. Johnny Ringo had a reputation as a moody and dangerous man, especially when he was drinking. He was known as a deadly gunslinger, though many of the tales about his duels might be exaggerated. What's certain is that he was a feared member of the Cowboys faction in Tombstone. He and Doc Holliday had a famous, tense confrontation in the street where it seemed a duel was about to happen, but the town marshal broke it up. Ringo's true danger came from his intelligence combined with his dark moods. No one ever knew what he was going to do next. His end is as mysterious as his life. He was found having passed away under a tree with a gunshot wound to his head. Some say he took his own way out, while others whisper that one of his many enemies, perhaps Wyatt Earp himself, finally caught up with him.